Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lynn Chastain with the Austin Chamber. Thank you for joining us today. I know this is a very difficult time during work from home, and the Chamber is trying to do all we can to help all of our members. Today's conversation is about helping you protect your company data. This is a very important issue, I know, because in working at the Chamber, I think I was the reason why we had a shutdown for at least a day, if not more. So I know it's really important. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought dramatic changes to business operations and employee workflows. Companies have adapted and found new ways to move forward, but what should we be doing to protect the data and security and in this state of work? Today we have leaders from Forcepoint, Dell Technologies, and Silicon Labs to share best practices for companies of all sizes as we shift gears from crisis response to a new normal. I'd like to thank our sponsors for our Power Up series, and it's Accenture, Amazon, Capital Metro, Goodwill Central Texas, RSM, the City of Austin Small Business, and Visa. And our supporting sustainers is the Austin Technology Incubator, KView, and the Austin American Statesman. So now I'm going to introduce our moderator. Jim Fulton is Forcepoint's Director of Cloud and Edge Protection Solutions. He has been developing and delivering enterprise cloud access and security products for more than 20 years in Austin and in Silicon Valley companies, such as Qualys, Digital Persona, Green Border, and also networking computing devices. Jim holds a BS in computer science from MIT and was one of the original developers of the X Windows systems. And Jim moved to Austin, the Austin area, to help create Forcepoint and lives outside Georgetown. Are you ready for this? Where he has goats, cows. So Jim, you're a real Texan now, so welcome.
Well, thank you, Lynn. Really appreciate that. And for everyone joining us today, really glad that you're able to share a little bit of time with us. I think it's going to be well worth it. I think what you're going to find is we've got a really interesting panel today. And we're lucky not just to be in the Austin area and to have these leaders from Austin-based companies, but these are some of the industry's top leaders globally in the issue of how do you protect your data, once your workforce now is no longer, inside, the company anymore. And so with that, what I'd like to do is sort of jump right in and have each of the panelists introduce themselves. First, we have Kevin Cross from Dell Technologies. Kevin?
Yeah, hi, it's Kevin Cross from Dell Technologies. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer. I'm actually working remote out of Maryland. So hi to everyone that's in the Austin area and anyone else around the world. I'm glad to be here today. Thanks for having me.
And we also have Sharon Hagi from Silicon Labs. Sharon?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharon Hagi. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Silicon Labs. We are a fabulous global semiconductor company, and we design and manufacture products that essentially address a wide range of applications in the industrial automation, consumer, automotive market worldwide. And in particular, we develop products that address mixed signal applications for the Internet of Things infrastructure, and that is an area of growth for us, and as such, a focus area for us also for security, and maybe something that we will talk about today in terms of how that is impacting work from home and the new reality with COVID-19.
Right.
Glad to be.
Good. Finally, last but not least, we have Carl Eberling from Forcepoint. Carl?
Hi there, Carl Eberling, CIO at Forcepoint, and we build and develop software that protects you and the clients that you're connecting on today and protect the data that transfers across it. I come from a background in really wireless communications, so grew up in Verizon Wireless, 20 some years. So this idea of mobility is one that's a fundamental part of my DNA and one I'm happy to have here at Forcepoint.
Great. Well, thank you. So to set the stage, let's just take just a couple of minutes. And if we think back, almost to the sort of the ancient times back in, say, March, many of our organizations looked kind of like this. There was a main office in the center, and in fact, there were various security systems there. Remote offices would often connect into that main office in order to access the cloud and the internet. And perhaps either using technologies you may be familiar with, you may be using, such as MPLS, which is a standard way that many branch offices connect in, or we're connecting in over the internet using virtual private networks, also known as VPNs. And for a while, this has really worked reasonably well for many organizations. There are a lot of different ways that people are connecting, and people are starting to use newer approaches that go direct to the cloud. But this represents for a lot of us what normal used to be. But then suddenly, the number of people who were working remotely almost overnight, exploded to where, for many of our organizations today, almost all of the workforce is working from home and probably is going to for a little while. And that led to a rethinking of how organizations were going to be coping. And in fact, our Forcepoint CTO, Nicholas Fischbach, wrote a really good blog that talked about sort of the week 1, 2, 3, 4 that a lot of companies that we were talking to were going through. And your experiences may in fact be somewhat similar. So you're not alone. And in many cases, the week 1, the first effort was really focused on, oh my, can we handle the load? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the internet bandwidth? Do our employees have the internet bandwidth for being able to work? Then week 2 became focused on, okay, so we have the plumbing set. Now, can we make sure that people have access to the applications and the data that they need in order to be productive? Whether those applications are up in the cloud, where, to be honest, that part's easy. But what about the applications inside the business, where we're very used to people simply being able to connect to them because they were inside the network? Well, when they're no longer inside the network, for many organizations, that immediately becomes a significant challenge. Then, as organizations began to at least deal with the sort of the fires and the burning crisis, then the next question they start to think about is, okay, now I have people productive. They're able to use data while working from home, working remotely. But that leads to the question, is that data safe? I've now got data going up in the cloud, even into places that it wasn't going into a couple of weeks ago. How am I keeping track of it? Do I know where it is? Do I know what people are doing? And then finally, sort of week 4 became focused on, okay, we're now starting to see reports, both in the news as well as our own people, telling us about how the number of attacks that they're experiencing, phishing, and so forth, going up dramatically. Frankly, bad guys were taking advantage of the situation, dealing with the fact that suddenly there were a lot of people who weren't used to working remotely, who perhaps didn't have all of the necessary defenses in place. That wasn't the focus. But suddenly it had to become the focus. And that's where we are now, really is almost in a repeat the cycle, as organizations have then started to say, okay, I got through the immediate crisis, we've got the business continuing, but now suddenly this isn't going away right anytime soon. How do we adjust things to create a new normal that is sustainable and manageable? Because ultimately what has happened is, with people going outside and data and applications going outside, more business is now happening beyond the walls, beyond the bounds of your business than ever before. And that is what is creating, many of the challenges as organizations look at how do you make sure that people can get to the data, but how do you also make sure that only the right people can get to that data so that your business not only continues, it continues securely. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists to spend just a couple of minutes here, talking about what's your perspective on what has been happening in the world. So each one will give a couple of minutes, and then we've got a set of questions and get to just a real open panel discussion here. So Kevin, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks. So looking at the COVID-19 situation, it's obviously an unprecedented situation in the world. When you look at it economically, health and safety, politically, tons of challenges all over the place. And it's one of those situations to where there is no standard playbook for how to navigate this type of crisis, even for people that have prepared for crises. So this is an example of where we really need to work together as much as possible, even more so than we've ever done before, to be able to navigate it. From the Dell perspective, when it comes to the remote workforce, our journey started really 10 years ago, and we've enabled a remote workforce, but even with that, it was really only supporting around 20% of the population at a given time. And we were, well equipped to be able to move quickly to this remote workforce type of environment, but moving from a 20% to a 90% for a company that has 150,000 plus people, presented itself a bunch of different challenges. And with that, just even personally, like a personal challenge, I was the interim CISO in November, and I became the permanent CISO in May. And so looking at my own journey of just ramping up into role and organizational transformation and things while we're navigating a crisis, just added to some of the complexity that we had. Given the challenges that we worked through, we did show that we have the ability to work well with a remote workforce. We're able to conduct business operations, we're able to meet sales and expectations of our customers. And so I think like many organizations, people are finding that this is going to be a new norm to a certain extent. Whether people fully stay remote or only a certain portion of an environment stays remote, I think this will be something that will continue to go forward. And with that presents new threats and risks and challenges that everyone needs to be able to work through to be able to ensure that you're able to conduct your business, but also do it in a really secure way. Just in general, this is the time to really reset, rethink, and replan and figure out for this new normal, how can we adapt to some of the things that were just shown in the slides to where we have people, we have data, we have systems all over the world, and how can we accommodate that in a really secure way?
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Sharon, what are your thoughts on what's been happening out there?
Yeah, so much like Kevin, I was also kind of navigating the crisis in March as we were kind of responding to it as well in our organization as interim CIO. Our CIO's retirement so happened to have coincided with the pandemic, so such is life. It was sort of an interesting experience for me, coming at it from a security executive and also sort of managing our IT team through this crisis. And one of the things that became apparent is that we're suffering sort of or experiencing this similar challenges to what a lot of organizations in our industry at least have been sort of experiencing. And most companies, up until COVID-19 and the whole work from home mode, have been really had two challenging choices. One choice was, as you had shown in your previous slide, was backhauling traffic through data centers. And essentially that's how employees and people who are working in branch offices access both internal on-prem applications and data as well as cloud deployed applications. The problem with that approach is that it's based on an assumption that employees predominantly work in offices, and that's where they need security. That's where they need protection. Not so much outside the office. I mean, if you're working outside the office with a mobile device, you can probably VPN into the very same data center and sort of again access all those resources from that perimeter. And again, that there's a lot of challenges with that because that obviously is very slow. It's high latency, especially when you're working in very remote places. If you're a global organization like we are, we have offices in the US and Asia and Europe, and not every office is connected with, a low latency sort of connection. It's also very complex. There's a lot of single points of failure, very expensive, and it really doesn't protect the end user outside the perimeter, to the same extent that they're protected inside the perimeter. The other choice that companies have had was to build perimeters around every office, right? So, essentially replicating gateways and replicating firewalls and deploying lots of appliances in each and every one of their remote sites and branch offices. That choice has been even more complex than the first one. There's a lot of, complicated equipment to manage. It's a lot more expensive to maintain. You have to distribute your IT support more thinly across, all of your global sites. And even that still does not protect the end user outside of the perimeter. And what we've seen is that when you have a situation where people move out of the corporate perimeter and are now working from home, today, essentially the situation that you have is that the internet itself is the new data center. And in this new reality, what you're essentially seeing is that the way we have responded to this crisis is we've had to basically refocus both our operational programs as well as our security programs to make sure that every user, every employee, and every person that's connecting to our data remotely is also a human firewall, if you will, who's hardened and can deal with the uptick in social engineering attacks that we're seeing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that every laptop, every mobile device, excuse me, now requires its own perimeter security and has to be protected to the same extent outside of the corporate perimeter as much as it was protected when it was inside. So instead of building, these monolithic moat and castle architectural paradigms as we've done in the past, now we have to build the same moat and castle paradigm around every single user and every single endpoint device. And that is the big thing that is different about this situation than any other situation. And if other companies have been sort of progressing towards that, that's great, but the pandemic has certainly been accelerating the transition to that model.
All right. Well, thank you. Very well put, and I think a lot of us are recognizing, very similar set of circumstances. Carl, how do you see what's been happening, and how's that been affecting you?
Yeah, I think in our careers, oftentimes there's, we'll pick a few key memories, and certainly this event is going to be one of those big memories that highlights my career. I'll never forget sitting there with the emergency preparedness team, and I really think they were looking at me as leader of IT to say why we couldn't work from home. And, I was very adamant that we were prepared, we were ready. And I think given the luxury too of going through an entire quarter now, really allowed us operationally to prove that not only could you just work from home and take meetings, but rather you could conduct the entire business of the organization over the course of that quarter. And then it's actually allowed us, as we love to talk about the Forcepoint on Forcepoint story that we have with our products, but it allowed us to really showcase exactly what Sharon was just saying, which is the people are the new perimeter of your network. Information is leaving your organization on a regular basis, whether it's on a laptop, a phone, a tablet, does not matter, or it's being remotely accessed from other machines. And so with that mindset, how we attacked security and protection from the very beginning, really just this event, albeit tragic, has allowed us to really showcase what it is we do.
Great. I think a great summary. Now what we'd like to do is, I'm going to stop sharing the screen so you can actually see the participants here. Move into just really having an open discussion here. To get things started, Kevin, when what would be your advice, looking at what you did as you shifted to work from home? What would be your advice for organizations of different sizes?
Yeah, when we first looked at moving from home, there's a couple of different risks that we were focused on initially, and one is just the sustainment of operations of like our cybersecurity team. So I'm thinking of our own team itself, of can we continue to do what we need to be able to do. And then you have the rest of the workforce that's moving from home, moving to home or moving to a remote location to where they're trying to do the same type of thing. Some of the challenges of things that we're looking at, which you touched on earlier, where we're looking at people that are potentially working off of insecure infrastructure in their own homes, or people working in coffee shops or other kinds of places to where it's not a clean, pristine environment that you're used to. You have threat actors trying to take advantage of any kind of crisis where people are using phishing kind of lures or malicious websites or mobile apps or anything else. And then you also have just the general risk of people that are trying to get their work done. And so maybe they don't have the right kinds of tools at their disposal, and they're willing to take more risks by using webmail or using removable media or using different things like that that might not be typically accepted within the environment. Um, when we moved to this remote workforce, Dell produces lots of products and services that support people from working from home. So we have cloud and network to edge, every type of technology in between, and we've already had this history of enabling a remote workforce. So for us, it was a fairly smooth transition for the most part. There's different things that we had to do from a crisis management perspective, to where we stood up teams early on and focused on communications to our employees and our workforce to have a pragmatic approach to being able to get people out and have them enabled. But in general, like every company out there went through the same and similar challenge of you had to ramp up in scope, increase scope for something. So you had to either move people home, give people equipment, increase bandwidth, new way of working, and then there's the new threats that are associated with that. I guess the five things just to kind of run through real quick that I would see is just kind of general advice for people for any size really company that you have. The first is just communication awareness and rules of engagement for this remote workforce type of environment. So what are people allowed to do? What are people not allowed to do with standard IT technology, whether it's video conferencing software like Zoom or any other thing that they have at their disposal, and having protocols for that, and ensure that you're giving that messaging consistently so people understand what they need to be doing. Because a lot of things, even though we try and use technology to control what people are allowed to do from a security perspective, there are things that are still up to the end user, such as opening an email, creating a Word document, or whatever else it might be. We from our crisis management perspective, we had a lot of global communications to the workforce. We also leveraged different technology to be able to create pop-up messages daily to people on their systems to be able to remind them and give them links to resources. So a lot of it was just communication, rules of engagement. Second thing is just continuing to evaluate the new threats and risks specific to your company. Everyone has a different type of company, different business operations. Some people are small or global in scale, but something has changed from the attack surface of where people are working at, and those threats and risks are different for everybody, but you need to really evaluate them. And then it's just looking at what you're currently doing and does it still work. In this new environment, if we're going to be in with a remote workforce, do all the tools and processes and technologies that you have, are they sufficient to still enable the business, and still sufficient to be able to do things in a secure way, or do we need to relook at things? And when we relook at it, then it comes down to where do we want to go? There's some things in which I think you had a slide for before, but we had immediate actions we needed to take place to get things up and running. But then it's what do we do in the near term, and then what do we do in the long term to enable this new distributed type of model, and what kind of security controls and capabilities do we need to have there? So there's different things that people are moving towards, whether it's zero trust architectures, or looking at user identity type things, or whether it's cloud solutions or SaaS. There are things that are going to be much more expansive than the typical on-site corporate data center, basic firewall network type of infrastructure thing. I guess the last piece I'll just highlight on is just the continued need to look at enterprise resiliency and crisis management, and having a plan to be able to deal with the crisis, because COVID's not necessarily over. I mean, we're at a certain point now, but it's really, really unpredictable. we really don't know, into the future if something breaks out within a second wave or things impact businesses in another way or any other kind of crisis comes up. The better planned you are, the better prepared you are, the better you're able to deal with it and to also practice it as well. So I think all those things would apply to pretty much any company of any size.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Sharon, what things worked well for you, and what issues did you run into that you hadn't expected?
Well, I mean, just, we're not a very large company. I mean, we're among the semiconductor companies. We're considered a rather small company. And I think one of the things that this crisis has definitely demonstrated is that black swan events can and do happen. And there was a renewed focus on, disaster recovery planning and just making sure that we are realigning our security policies, procedures, and operational maturity to be able to address a reality where the vast majority of employees and where business is actually conducted and where data actually resides is, as I mentioned before, is no longer within the corporate perimeter. And it does require, a renewed look at enterprise architecture, for example. And I think that this is applicable, by the way, not to a small size organization, but also to bigger ones. Just much like Kevin mentioned, one of the things that we very early on recognized is that the velocity of communications with our employees has to increase. And it has to increase for a variety of different reasons, both from making sure that, we're still connected as a company and that we're still able to operate, but also the velocity with which we can disseminate critical time information about, threats. The whole uptick in social engineering attacks, we have to make sure that employees are aware of new novel techniques through which, these adversaries are communicating or trying to get in touch with employees, and having those spear phishing or directed phishing attacks. It's really important to share that information very, very quickly and to develop the kind of communication cadence with the company, making sure that security, for example, is part of regular town hall and regular update meetings that we have with employees, and keep reminding them, and this is something that we've done actually, keep reminding them that, with this work from home reality, our security and data protection imperatives are very much still in place and still need to be addressed, and that security is essentially still a shared responsibility. And again, with a large organization, that becomes more challenging, and you have to be able to have the system and the capabilities to actually do that in a sustained fashion. So, this isn't a sprint, right? You got to basically run the marathon and keep doing that. To make sure that your ability to protect and inform is maintained. Another thing that I was going to say is that, as I mentioned before, it's a good opportunity to sort of reassess whether the current architecture, the current infrastructure, and the current data processing paradigms that are used in organizations still meet the needs when the vast majority of employees are no longer working in the office, and even when you have suppliers and contractors, et cetera, still needing to connect. And what are the new paradigms for a perimeterless corporation that literally has data everywhere? The internet is the new data center, but you still need to be able to enforce policies. You still have to be able to inspect what sort of data is being accessed, what are the policies, what are the definition points, and be able to have that real-time global visibility to threats and applications and users, so that when something does happen, you can have that incident response capability as it applies to incidents, and be able to orchestrate and coordinate response, as with people being basically everywhere. So that is an important sort of opportunity to be able to revisit that and make sure that it works in this new reality.
Cool. And so Carl, what, as you really shifted the organization to working from home, what unexpected issues did you run into? And were you pleased with the results? Were there any that now you look back on and say, well, perhaps we should do that a little differently?
There's been a couple of things. One is we underestimated, the need for a connection once people got home. Honestly, one of the anomalies that certainly we saw was as we started to move and do more webinar or online type of training, where you might, and it was funny because Kevin was talking and mentioning, some of the education aspects, around security and protecting yourself and, kind of being more mindful, just like you would do physically at home. You're going to lock your doors at night. How does that translate to the digital world? Well, we would host some early on, sessions within the organization. And where I was used to somebody coming to something like maybe you get 20 people, 30 people that would show up to a boring security discussion, we were getting maxed out. So 500 might have been a limit on a regular meeting. Then we switched over to webinars and we were getting 3,000 people to a webinar. And it was, people were home. They were concerned about these things. They wanted to make sure that they were staying connected and that they were, staying safe. And so I think if I learned anything, it was that need for the personal communication, the connection like this was probably a bit underestimated. And then you absolutely heard it from both Sharon and Kevin that there's been a huge uptick in terms of threat attempts out there. And this isn't made up from a security vendor. This is coming from the professionals of DHS and around the globe that are just seeing probably people at home bored. Youth and that around the world that are using it as an opportunity to have fun from their couch remotely. So it's absolutely important for people to stay vigilant, just as vigilant as you would in the office as you are at home. So.
Mm-hmm. And so, Kevin, if we let's double click into this issue of the escalation of attacks out there. Did this cause you to change either how you were deploying any aspects of your security, or did it interrupt things beyond simply being an issue of scale?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a lot of the attacks that we saw were really not that novel in nature. It's the same type of thing that you see across the board. It's just the themes and the social engineering type of aspects of it change. So when it comes to either phishing or people making malicious websites or making malicious mobile apps, it's more of like the theme and the uptick of that, of trying to have people take advantage of it. So for ourselves, a lot of the security stack that we already have and our telemetry and our threat intelligence and all those types of things really didn't change a whole lot. What changed a little bit though was just everything being in a remote workforce of and ensuring that we were enabling our VPN and leveraging that to be able to secure all the communications that we have back. We're a really VPN centric company right now, and we backhaul a lot of different data to do deep packet inspection. And so when you have a difference between 20% of your workforce and your entire workforce in that particular situation, there was less on the threats and more of just how can we protect these actual systems that are not behind a normal type of perimeter. And so with that, looking at ensuring that we have either always on type of VPN capability, we don't have that configured right now, but trying to convince people to make sure they're using the VPN, while at the same time we want to be able to enable business. So we have other alternatives to where people are able to use Office 365 and other kinds of mechanisms to be able to leverage their email or Teams and things like that, which maybe lessens your security protections a little bit in that regard. So it was a balance of those things. I mean, we have other initiatives to where we're doing things like endpoint modernization. So we're looking at all the different security clients that we have on a given endpoint, which I'm sure lots of companies have, to where you're trying to consolidate instead of having 10 different vendors, you kind of narrow that down. A lot of those that are working on just traditional on-premise types of solutions, didn't really necessarily work well unless you're able to funnel all the information back through the VPN. So it doesn't have the same kind of flexibility. So transition to more cloud native types of solutions to where regardless of where the endpoint is, they can still feed information back through the cloud. We're on a carbon black journey, which is, one of our Dell products, the same kind of capability there. But there are things like that we've looked to change. So to some degree, it changed the prioritization of initiatives that we already had in flight, more so than anything else.
Mm-hmm. So, question for both Sharon and Carl and Kevin as well. Kevin, you described how your organization primarily is focused on backhauling. So most of what people are doing involves VPNing back into the central network and then eventually egressing back out when they're interacting with the internet or the cloud. What about for Silicon Labs and Forcepoint? Are either of you either shifting to having people connect directly to the cloud more, or are you still having all traffic as Kevin was describing coming back through your central offices?
Well, I mean, we employ very much the same model because before the pandemic, we were, sort of office environment and corporate perimeter centric. And when the pandemic started, basically that was the same thing. I mean, when users needed to access both on-prem applications as well as cloud-based, the assumption was that they were connecting with a VPN and backhauling traffic. And as the traffic is flowing through the corporate environment, it's subject to the same level of protection and inspection and enforcement, et cetera, as any other traffic that you would have been seeing inside the office environment. However, with sort of like direct-to-cloud access, when you're talking about Office 365 and some other applications, right, you actually don't need the VPN, right? And what ends up happening is that when users are sort of gravitating towards using Zoom and Microsoft Teams and some of these applications. In fact, the perception is that being on VPN is actually negatively impacting your experience, and so people actually prefer to shut it down. When traffic isn't backhauled, when it's not backhauled through the corporate perimeter, then what happens is you lose a lot of that inspection enforcement, and you end up essentially now increasing the risk, in fact. Because a lot of this stuff is actually happening without appropriate enforcement and appropriate levels of visibility. Mm-hmm. And so that is a concern, and we are looking into it. And I think a lot of companies are kind of like in the same sort of area of challenge in terms of, now a lot of the stuff that, as we accelerate our migration to cloud and more of our critical applications and data are actually accessed outside the perimeter again, we tend to kind of rely more on controls that are deployed at the endpoint. But we also have to essentially look at the internet itself and SaaS, security as a service, if you will, where traffic needs to be proxied and inspected, through mechanisms such as CASB or Cloud Application Security Broker that is able to provide that level of introspection and visibility on the kind of data that you're sending back and forth between endpoints, between users, endpoints, and cloud applications, right? To make sure that data is protected in Salesforce or SAP or Oracle or whatever, business system that is being used, again, outside of the perimeter. And that is forcing us to kind of, again, reevaluate those architectural paradigms. Because, this situation is not temporary. This situation is more or less, from an IT perspective, permanent. Even if we do find ourselves going back to sort of more or less the normal way of doing business back in March, where people are going to come back into the office, I still foresee that the very same requirements around endpoint protection, user education hardening around social engineering, all of those things are still going to be relevant and very much needed, regardless of what's going to happen.
I think, the big difference probably between what we did versus what I've heard explained elsewhere is very much I took a tiered approach that if you didn't need VPN, I encourage people to go to our single sign-on interface. So head to there first, because so much of what we had was already shifted out, as Sharon had said, into SaaS-based applications. And of course, we have a cloud access security broker. So we've been a big proponent and leverager of that for some time. So it's given us that comfort level to be able to do exactly as Sharon said: proxy the traffic, inspect it, make sure it's safe, and ensure that we've protected those routes. So whether it's Workday, SAP, Salesforce, ServiceNow, we were able to shift enough volume there that really we see a limited amount that has to go through the VPN, and a lot of that is very specialized workloads and stuff that we have internally. So been to both points, it won't go back to normal. This will be the approach I think people will take going forward.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Kevin.
oh yeah, sorry, just to add on, like, we're taking a hybrid approach. Sharon, like the example that you explained is really the journey that we've been on, where we're very VPN centric, but then, you know, where things that are leveraging like Office 365 or something like that, we're looking at implementing CASB solutions to be able to do inspection and control of things there. And at the same time, we're looking to do more app-specific VPN kinds of capabilities. So there's capabilities from VMware, and you know, Dell, we use the same family of suite of things to be able to control things, but to do things in different ways. So I think we're going to be in a hybrid solution over time, to where, you know, we're just trying to adapt to the new model of the world.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of organizations talk to us about replacing VPNs, at least for web-based internal web-based applications, with technologies. I think Kevin, you mentioned zero trust network access technologies, which are essentially ways of providing access to internal applications without end users having to spin up a VPN. Do you see those playing a role in your organization over the next year to 2 years, or how do you view them?
Yeah, yeah, we're definitely looking to, you know, look at our architecture overall, move to more zero trust type of methodologies. And there's not, you know, you're not really going out there and buying a zero trust tool. It's more of an approach to things. We're trying to figure out, you know, how are we going to deal with the entities, the identities, and the actual data, and then be able to, you know, control aspects of things, and ensuring that, you know, use multi-factor authentication and things like that, but to account and you know, trust each type of activity that we're actually doing. So yeah, we're going to keep moving into, you know, hybrid models of solutions to be able to enable access from a variety of different mechanisms over time. And I think, you know, we have on a roadmap to still continue the VPN path, but shift to more of an always on VPN, which we don't have now. So it would be more seamless to a user from the user experience, but at the same time, we're building out capabilities to potentially transition away from a VPN completely, or at least have that hybrid alternative for different applications or sites and things of that nature, like you described, that don't really necessarily need that same, you know, VPN protection.
Yeah, I think we're going to look at the same sort of approaches in terms of zero trust or private access, per app access, in fact, on demand to specific internal applications. But again, you know, a lot of those things are, the need for those is over time going to diminish, because I think a lot of organizations are migrating critical workloads to more of a cloud-based approach. Either, you know, you're leveraging some kind of a public cloud environment or a private cloud environment, and of course a hybrid of the two. And again, as that happens more and more, you know, the need for VPN or next generation VPN, zero trust sort of model is going to, again, sort of diminish a little bit. But I think one of the most important things, one of the most important reasons why we also want to do that is not just from a security perspective, but also from a productivity perspective. A lot of those new sort of seamless and transparent technologies help alleviate a lot of the user sort of obstacles, if you will, or challenges that they've been facing and experiencing, right? I mean, we talked about a lot of endpoint technologies that are running on end user devices and VPN and all of that. You know, a lot of security that's been built over the years has been really adding more and more burden on the user, because when they need to access something, they gotta authenticate to a VPN, and then they gotta authenticate again. And there's a lot of hurdles that they have to go through. And I think that, you know, looking at all those new technologies, new approaches to access, both at an identity management level, as well as the data loss prevention and CASB and all of those things, yeah, there's a security reason why we want to do it. There's definitely that, but I think there's also a huge productivity and performance consideration as well. And so when we look at it that way, it's much easier to develop the appropriate business cases and actually get investment and funding, which is what we need.
So we had a good question asked. Thank you, Michael Silverman. Carl, could you start us off? And I'd like to hear each of your perspectives. Michael was asking about, we've talked about the uptick in attacks and the issues out at the endpoints. With so many endpoints out there, what can you say a little bit about the kinds of attacks that you've seen? Because each of you probably have better insight than most people as to what's actually happening out there. So can we talk about that, and also about does it differ according to people in your organization who are using sort of corporate managed endpoints, or perhaps using their own personal computers for accessing? Carl, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, it's to me, it's hands down, it's the phishing attacks, and we're just seeing a huge spike in them. My old commanding general was General Jim Mattis, and he loves to talk about, in a crisis, your normal feedback loops are broken. So if you think about it, employees went to the office, they knew when there was renewal time for their benefits, for example, right? Because there'd be posters up and, open enrollment season coming soon. Well, those feedback loops are now gone, and it's a lot easier to spoof and pretend that there's a new open enrollment period, for example, and it's all because of COVID. And they'll send out those types of phishing attacks that are really easy to become susceptible to, for the simple fact that your other feedback loops that would normally be there to complement those emails coming in aren't there. And so, the coaching I'm giving people is, taking a little bit more caution. Make sure you're stepping through the normal inspection process that we've trained people to do. Do the hover over, make sure you see the right domain on the email. Contextually, is it contextually accurate? Does it seem too good to be true? Those types of things. So it's just reinforcing that need for the training. But at least from what we've seen and been talking to people, it's been these phishing style attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Carl, and can only add that what we've seen is an uptick in highly targeted phishing as well. I mean, it seems like the bad guys know that people in finance and people in some critical areas of the business are working remote, and they don't have that feedback loop that Carl you were mentioning, right? Because in the office, when somebody gets a phone call from somebody to do something, right, they can very easily walk over to somebody's office, a controller or a CFO, and just confirm that this is in fact what they want, right? And you don't get that, and sometimes the adversaries are taking advantage that there is this disconnection, if you will, and the fact that we're all working from home and we're not really around the corner, and they're taking advantage by actually putting the pressure, right, the urgency, and it's a lot easier to do when you have a workforce that's kind of working outside the office. And so that's something that's really a concern. And one of the things that I've been sort of asking people to do when they do get these sort of phishing attacks is to use out-of-band communication, is to use something that's not in line. If they're getting an email from somebody asking them to transfer money or whatever, to go through another communication method to see whether this person is actually on our Slack or Teams, or they can send them a direct SMS to a telephone number that is listed in the corporate directory. Somehow verify the identity using an out-of-band mechanism, just to make sure. Again, because of the fact that they're missing that feedback mechanism otherwise. So that I think is something very, very important at this point.
Yeah, I think a lot of the threats they've changed in theme, but the same type of threats always apply, whether we're working from home or working in the office. When we're dealing with our systems, and phishing, as what Carl and Sharon said, is really still the top way that people are trying to attack corporations. Malicious websites as well, which kind of goes hand in hand with that. Or if you have like malicious mobile apps that are being created. I think in this case, even the Johns Hopkins website that was providing a lot of the COVID statistics was spoofed, and they made like a mirrored malicious version of that. So people are trying to take advantage of every means they can, with the common fear of things that people are having in society that gives them more willingness to be able to click on something or do something else. We have a pretty robust security awareness program and phishing training, and we test our employees and actually send out, phishing examples of people to try and help further educate the workforce. And we have a button that people can click to submit phishing emails to deeper inspection, and we have a whole team dedicated to that. So it's still the user being the link that people trying to exploit is a challenge. And even if you put technology in between, the user is the last line of defense or the first line of defense, depending on how you look at it. So it's still a huge thing to be able to address for sure.
So are you seeing a difference in going beyond phishing? Are any of you seeing a difference in the form of attacks that perhaps are directed at the systems and infrastructure itself as well? Or because clearly phishing is the number one, but what's the number two?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, this is really the only form that we've visibly seen a statistical increase in incidents in both targeting and severity. I wouldn't say that there's any other form of cyber attack or cyber threat that we've seen sort of as dramatically sort of impacting us as much as this spear phishing and direct phishing. I think that has been primarily the focus of the adversaries, again, taking advantage of some of the disconnection and feedback loop that is not there. I think that is primarily the concern that we have with right now.
Yeah, that adds, I mean, like phishing being popular, things targeted at actual users. They're really like the frontal assault types of attacks that people are doing. It's far less, unless you're looking at like web applications and things like that. So I know we haven't seen a particular uptick in people trying to exploit any of our web applications or services or platforms there, but a lot of that is just dependent upon what vulnerabilities are out there. So new vulnerabilities, new 0 days, and sophisticated threat actors jump on those right away to try and take advantage of and exploit those. But that I think is kind of life on internet type of thing, more so than any kind of uptick that we would have experienced with COVID. The one piece that you assume is probably happening, even though I don't have necessarily a bunch of direct evidence, but is more attacks on home infrastructure. So home Wi-Fi's or insecure routers and devices like that, knowing that more of the workforce globally is working from home, you would assume that there's an uptick there, but it's a mechanism to where we just don't necessarily have the visibility into it, or we haven't experienced, or nor have I seen huge roll-ups of statistics to be able to show that. But that's just more of an assumption, I think.
You're seeing more of the more pressure on the time to attack, right? So when you talk about the 0 day attacks, those are always of utmost interest because you usually have a very narrow window before people start to get exploited. And so when laptops or machines are in the office and they're consistently, say, plugged into the network, or you're able to control the software distribution in a quicker way, it's easier. They're at home, they opt not to come in through the VPN, or they opt not to allow for the downloaded distribution to upgrade or force the patching. It becomes a bigger challenge. And so again, it's getting in connection with your users, make sure that they aren't putting those updates into abeyance, that they're treating the health of their equipment just like they would anything else in their household. So
I agree with Kevin. I was going to say we do see concern with employee and home Wi-Fi configurations, and it is an issue that we've noticed because even from a productivity perspective, there's a lot of sometimes quality of service challenges, especially when people are joining conferences all day long, right? And it ends up being that the root cause a lot of these things is about just basically poorly configured wireless networks at home. Mm-hmm. And with that poor configuration, you also have insecurities, right? You have poorly secured wireless networks, and and it is easy to attack those home environments. And so yeah, I agree with the comment that was made earlier, Kevin and Carl, that it is a source of concern as well.
So with that, we're going to let that be the last word. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists here, Kevin, Sharon, Carl. This is a very complex topic, and it's been a very hard one for many organizations out there. Really appreciate having a chance to hear from you and hear some of the scars that you've developed over the last couple of months, and how people can take that as they look forward and to really adjust and create their own new normal. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Lynn to really bring us home here.
Thank you, Jim. And I really appreciate everyone's comments. Kevin, Sharon, and Carl, thank you so much. Today's webinar is recorded and it will be posted on the Chamber's website. And we'll also have tips from today's session posted as well. I did want to mention a couple of other housekeeping items. The 2 upcoming webinars, the Austin Gives virtual mixer, will also have an element of storytelling and best practices. And July 21st is a mid-year economic update, and that is from RSM. That is going to be something you don't want to miss. The person that's doing this is a national economist. He's really great, so don't miss that. I wanted to remind you to register to vote. The deadline is June 15th, and early voting starts July 14th. And you can learn more about that at votetexas.gov. There's also the 2020 census coming up, and that's actually used for 2 things. One is to determine the number of seats in Congress, and also locally, if you haven't read this, but there's stories in the paper, our Austin City Council is looking at expanding our districts and going from 10 to 14. And that census and where everyone's located will help them draw the district maps. So please don't forget that. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And to your success, stay safe. Thank you.